The flame reached 20 meters before the screaming started. 20 meters of pressurized liquid fire, coating concrete, filling trenches, consuming oxygen faster than human lungs could process what was happening. The German engineers examining the captured blueprints had understood the physics intellectually, the mathematics of fuel viscosity, ignition temperature, effective range. But understanding fire on paper and witnessing fire as a weapon are separated by the width of everything that makes us human. In 6 seconds, the demonstration would teach them why the British had invested years perfecting a device that turned the simple act of creating fire into something that transcended conventional warfare and entered the realm of absolute psychological dominance. This is the story of how German forces captured intact plans for Britain's most terrifying close-quarters weapon, the flamethrower that could clear a bunker in seconds. But it is really about the moment military professionals confronted the gap between theoretical weapon design and the visceral reality of what those designs created, and what it reveals about humanity's capacity to engineer not just destruction, but fear itself, to weaponize the most primal terror embedded in our evolutionary memory, and to then look at what we have created and ask if some weapons cross a line that no tactical advantage can justify. July 1942. A British commando raid on the French coast near Dieppe goes catastrophically wrong. In the chaos of retreat, a Royal Engineers sergeant makes a decision that will haunt British intelligence for months. Rather than destroy the prototype flamethrower his team had been testing against coastal fortifications, rather than strip the targeting mechanisms and fuel regulators and throw them into the channel, he leaves it. The device falls into German hands intact. Within 48 hours, it is on a train to Berlin. Within a week, it sits on an examination table at the Wehrmacht testing facility at Kummersdorf, surrounded by engineers who have been tasked with answering a single question. How does a device weighing 35 kilograms allow one man to neutralize a reinforced concrete bunker containing 20 soldiers in less than 10 seconds? To understand what those German engineers found when they disassembled that captured weapon, you first need to understand what they believed about flamethrowers. They believed flamethrowers were known technology, crude weapons with limited tactical application, useful perhaps for clearing vegetation or creating panic in poorly trained troops, but ultimately more psychological tool than genuine combat multiplier. They believed German engineering had already extracted maximum utility from the concept with their own Flamethrower models. They believed the British version would offer minor refinements at best, incremental improvements in range or fuel efficiency, but nothing revolutionary. They believed warfare was moving toward precision, toward ranged engagement, toward clean technical solutions to tactical problems. The device on their examination table was about to systematically dismantle every one of those comfortable assumptions. Oberingenieur Klaus Richter drew the first assignment. 42 years old, veteran of the Great War where he had seen the earliest flamethrowers used in trench warfare, he carried the particular weariness of men who had watched warfare evolve from cavalry charges to mechanized slaughter. His initial assessment notes preserved in Wehrmacht archives radiate professional confidence. Quote, "Preliminary examination suggests standard pressure-fed system utilizing petroleum-based fuel mixture. Estimated effective range 12 to 15 meters. Classification, area denial weapon. Limited tactical value against hardened positions." End quote. He expected to spend perhaps 3 days documenting minor British innovations before filing a report recommending no changes to German doctrine. The first surprise came when Richter's team measured the fuel tanks. Capacity, 14 liters, standard for the period, but the fuel itself was wrong. Not gasoline, not diesel, not the crude petroleum jellies German flamethrowers used. This was something else. A mixture so viscous it barely flowed at room temperature, yet the injection system suggested it could be propelled at extraordinary pressure. Richter ordered a chemical analysis. The results arrived 2 days later and made him request a second verification test because the numbers seemed impossible. The British had created a synthetic gel that burned at temperatures approaching 900 degrees Celsius, clung to surfaces like glue, so could not be extinguished with water, and remained combustible for over 60 seconds. One of Richter's chemists noted in the margin of his report, "This is not fuel. This is malice given chemical form." But fuel chemistry was only the first layer of innovation. The delivery system revealed thinking that had transcended conventional weapon design and entered territory that made even experienced military engineers uncomfortable. The British had solved a problem German flamethrower teams had struggled with for decades. How to project flame far enough to be tactically useful, while maintaining enough coherence and temperature to be genuinely lethal against protected positions. German Flammenwerfer could throw fire perhaps 10 to 12 meters on a good day, often less in combat conditions when pressure fluctuated and fuel quality varied. The British device specifications indicated effective range of 20 meters. 20 meters of sustained flame that arrived with enough force and temperature to penetrate firing slits, flow around corners, consume defensive positions from the inside out. Richter requisitioned a bunker mock-up for live testing. What happened next would be described in Wehrmacht reports with language rarely seen in technical documents. Language of horror. Language of men confronting a weapon that violated some unspoken compact about how war should be conducted. The demonstration bunker matched standard German defensive construction. Reinforced concrete walls 40 centimeters thick. Steel firing ports with overlapping fields of fire. Interior space of approximately 8 by 4 meters. Multiple entrance points to allow defending troops tactical flexibility. The British weapon was positioned 22 meters away, outside theoretical maximum effective range. Richter's notes indicate he expected the test to demonstrate the limitations of the design, to provide data supporting his preliminary conclusion that while innovative, the weapon remained a specialized tool of limited battlefield value. The operator triggered the ignition sequence. Pressurized fuel erupted from the nozzle in a stream so coherent it looked almost solid in the morning light. Then the ignition charge fired. What followed was described by observing officers as less like conventional fire and more like liquid sun. The flame reached the bunker's primary firing slit in under 2 seconds, and then it entered. This is the part of the story where we need to slow down and understand something about military psychology and the unspoken rules that govern how professional soldiers think about combat. There exists an implicit hierarchy of acceptable violence in warfare. Bullets kill cleanly, we tell ourselves. Artillery delivers impersonal death from distance. Even grenades offer the mercy of quick obliteration. These deaths are terrible, yes, but they exist within a framework of military necessity and tactical logic that allows soldiers to function without complete psychological collapse. Fire occupies a different category entirely. Fire is intimate. Fire is slow. Fire triggers panic responses embedded so deeply in human neurology that they predate language, predate tools, predate everything we consider civilization. We evolved in a world where fire meant survival when controlled and extinction when it was not. Weaponizing fire means weaponizing that primal terror. The flame entered the bunker through a firing slit measuring 12 centimeters wide and 30 centimeters tall. Physics says this should have dissipated the stream, broken the coherence, reduced the threat to manageable levels. The British fuel gel did not obey those expectations. It flowed through the narrow opening like something alive, like something seeking. Inside the bunker, test dummies had been positioned at realistic defensive stations. Richter had placed temperature sensors throughout the interior space to measure heat distribution, to quantify how much the concrete walls would absorb, to determine safe exposure thresholds. 18 seconds after ignition, every temperature sensor had exceeded its maximum rating of 800 degrees Celsius. The concrete itself was radiating heat. The air inside the bunker had transformed into an environment incompatible with human respiration. Not just hot air, not just smoke-filled lungs struggling to extract oxygen. The flame was consuming oxygen faster than human biology could compensate. Even soldiers who somehow avoided direct contact with burning gel would asphyxiate in less than 20 seconds. And the gel itself, the terrible innovation that made this weapon transcend conventional flamethrowers, the gel clung to every surface it touched. The test dummies emerged from the demonstration, coated in fire that water could not extinguish. Sound smothered it temporarily, but the gel reignited when exposed to air. The only effective countermeasure the German engineers discovered was complete immersion in foam-based suppressant, equipment that no frontline bunker would possess, equipment that no soldier under attack could deploy in time. Richter's official report, submitted August 3, 1942, represented a profound shift from his initial assessment. Gone was the professional detachment, the confident categorization of the weapon as tactically limited. In its place, language that struggled to articulate what the test had revealed. He wrote, quote, "The British flamethrower represents a fundamental rethinking of close assault weaponry. Effective range and lethality exceed all German equivalents by significant margins. But more critically, the psychological impact of this weapon system may render conventional bunker defense untenable. Soldiers facing this device must choose between remaining in a defensive position that becomes a crematorium or abandoning cover and facing conventional arms fire. There is no tactical doctrine that adequately addresses this dilemma." End quote. Buried in paragraph 7 of Richter's 12-page analysis was a sentence that would circulate through Wehrmacht command structures for months afterward, generating debates that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with the uncomfortable questions militaries prefer not to ask. He wrote, "We must consider whether weapons can be so effective at creating terror that their use constitutes a form of warfare that transcends tactical necessity and becomes simply cruelty made systematic." This was not a question German engineers were supposed to ask in 1942. Germany was waging total war. Germany was deploying weapons and tactics that would later be classified as war crimes. Germany had already crossed lines that would haunt the world for generations. For a Wehrmacht engineer to examine a British weapon and conclude it might be too cruel for legitimate warfare required a form of cognitive dissonance that reveals something profound about how humans rationalize violence. We can participate in atrocity, can execute orders that destroy cities and populations, but still maintain categories of unacceptable violence, still draw lines in our own minds about what crosses from military necessity into pure sadism. The fact that those lines are arbitrary, that they shift based on who is drawing them and who is suffering, does not make them less real to the people trying to preserve some fragment of moral identity in a world dedicated to industrial-scale killing. The German High Command response to Richter's report demonstrated exactly this contradiction. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht issued orders to develop German equivalents immediately. The weapon was too effective to ignore, too tactically valuable to dismiss based on squeamishness about its effects. Simultaneously, propaganda offices received instructions to prepare materials characterizing British flamethrower use as a war crime, as evidence of Allied barbarism, as proof that Germany faced an enemy willing to violate the basic humanity that should govern even total war. The same weapon system was both urgently necessary for German tactical advantage and morally reprehensible proof of British savagery. Both positions were held simultaneously, without apparent irony or recognition of the contradiction. But developing a weapon and deploying it effectively are separated by the gulf of human psychology. Throughout late 1942 and into 1943, German engineers worked to replicate the British fuel gel formula and delivery system. They succeeded in creating functionally equivalent systems, flamethrowers with effective ranges approaching 20 meters, fuel mixtures that burned hotter, clung more tenaciously, resisted extinguishing more completely than anything in the German arsenal. Technical success was achieved in approximately 9 months. But technical capability and tactical deployment faced an obstacle the engineers had not anticipated, an obstacle embodied in the men who would have to use these weapons. Gefreiter Hans Müller was among the first German soldiers selected for flamethrower training using the improved systems inspired by captured British designs. 24 years old, veteran of campaigns in Poland and France, he had volunteered for specialized weapons training, expecting to gain technical skills that might keep him away from frontline infantry duty. His training diary, preserved by family members and later donated to German military archives, provides rare insight into the psychological burden of being trained to operate a weapon specifically designed to create maximum suffering. Müller's early entries are routine: technical specifications, safety procedures, maintenance protocols. Then comes the first live fire exercise against a bunker mock-up populated with mannequins. His entry that evening, July 14th, 1943. Today we burn the dummies. The instructors call it familiarization training. Familiarizing us with what exactly? With the sound of fire hitting concrete? With the smell of fuel gel burning? With the knowledge that the mannequins are standing in for human beings? And tomorrow or next week, we will do this to actual people who will scream and burn and die in ways that bullets do not kill. I understand now why flamethrower operators on the Eastern Front request transfers after 3 or 4 engagements. Not because of danger, because of dreams. This was the unspoken cost of perfecting terror weapons, the psychological burden transferred to the operators themselves. Soldiers could fire rifles at distant enemies, could launch artillery at map coordinates, could drop bombs from altitudes where the humans below were abstractions. These actions permitted psychological distance, allowed soldiers to maintain narratives about combat as duty and necessity rather than intimate violence. Flamethrower operators possessed no such distance. They watched their targets burn, heard the screams, smelled the results. The weapon's effectiveness at creating terror was matched by its effectiveness at destroying the psychological defenses soldiers needed to remain functional. Wehrmacht training protocols attempted to address this through desensitization and ideological reinforcement. Instructors emphasized tactical necessity, reminded operators that they were neutralizing enemy strongpoints that would otherwise cost German lives, framed the weapon's horrific effects as unfortunate but justified by military requirement. Some soldiers internalized these justifications successfully. Others, like Müller, found that intellectual frameworks collapsed when confronted with sensory reality. He wrote in August 1943, "The instructors keep saying we are saving German lives. This is true. Every bunker we clear without sending infantry into machine gun fire is German soldiers who go home. I understand this. I believe this. And still I wake at 3 a.m. seeing the test dummies on fire and knowing they are not dummies anymore in my dreams." By late 1943, Wehrmacht medical officers were documenting psychological casualties among flamethrower units at rates significantly higher than conventional infantry. The data was quietly classified, and training protocols were adjusted to include more intensive psychological screening, but the fundamental problem remained unsolvable. You cannot make humans comfortable with using fire as a weapon without either selecting for individuals lacking normal empathy or breaking something essential in healthy minds. Meanwhile, the weapons themselves were being deployed with increasing frequency on all fronts. In Italy, German flamethrower teams used British-inspired designs to clear Allied positions in mountain bunkers, where conventional assault would have been prohibitively costly. In Normandy, defensive bunkers that had been considered impregnable strongpoints were systematically neutralized by British and Canadian forces, using the very weapons German engineers had studied and attempted to replicate. The tactical effectiveness was undeniable. Positions that could withstand artillery bombardment, that could repel infantry assault, that could hold against armor if properly sighted. These positions became death traps when flame weapons entered the equation. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate casualties. Soldiers knew bunkers could be burned, knew that concrete walls became ovens when fire entered. The knowledge itself became a weapon, eroding the sense of security that defensive positions were supposed to provide, forcing defenders to weigh impossible choices between staying and dying or fleeing and dying. After the war, military theorists attempting to quantify the flamethrower's impact struggled with metrics. How do you measure the value of a weapon whose primary effect is not casualties inflicted, but will broken, morale shattered, defensive positions abandoned, not because they were destroyed, but because defending them became psychologically untenable? One British after-action report from the Italian campaign noted that German positions attacked with flamethrowers showed casualty rates of only 40%, below the casualty rates from successful artillery or infantry assault. But surrender rates approached 90% among survivors. The soldiers were not being killed out of their positions. They were being terrified out of them. Klaus Richter, the engineer who had conducted the initial assessment of the captured British weapon, survived the war and was interviewed extensively by Allied intelligence officers in 1946. His reflections provide rare insight into how military professionals rationalize their role in developing terror weapons. He stated, "I was trained as an engineer, not a philosopher or ethicist. My job was to evaluate weapons systems objectively, to determine their tactical utility, to recommend improvements or countermeasures based on technical analysis. This is what I did. I documented the flamethrower's capabilities accurately. I noted its psychological impact honestly, whether Germany should have pursued equivalent weapons, whether anyone should deploy such devices. These were not questions engineers were empowered to answer. We provided data. Others made policy. This division of labor allowed me to sleep at night during the war. It does not allow me to sleep now. This is the machinery of modern warfare. The fragmentation of moral responsibility across so many individuals and institutions that no single person must confront the full weight of what is being created. Engineers design weapons without making deployment decisions. Soldiers use weapons without making strategic policy. Commanders issue orders without pulling triggers. Everyone operates within their defined role, following their specific duty, and the ultimate horror emerges from the collective action of people who individually believe they are simply doing their jobs professionally. The British weapon that sparked this entire chain of development and deployment and moral compromise was itself the product of similar fragmentation. Some engineer designed the fuel gel without burning anyone personally. Some metallurgist perfected the pressure systems without aiming the device at a human target. Some military planner approved its deployment based on tactical assessments that reduced screaming men to casualty statistics and morale impact percentages. Every person in the chain could maintain plausible distance from the end result, could tell themselves they were contributing to military effectiveness rather than to systematic cruelty, could sleep because their specific role seemed bounded and justifiable in isolation. Until you see it demonstrated, until you watch fire flow into a bunker and imagine being inside. Until the abstract becomes visceral and the statistics become screams, then the distance collapses. Then the comfortable intellectual frameworks that allow engineers to be objective and soldiers to be dutiful and commanders to be strategic. Those frameworks encounter the physical reality they have created, and suddenly the mathematics of fuel viscosity and ignition temperature transform into knowledge that 20 meters away, human beings are dying in the most terrifying way evolution prepared our species to fear. The flamethrower represented not just tactical innovation, but a kind of philosophical challenge to how militaries thought about weapons development. For centuries, military technology had trended toward making death more efficient, more distant, more abstract. Arrows gave way to firearms, gave way to artillery, gave way to aerial bombardment. Each innovation increased the physical and psychological distance between killer and killed, made warfare more industrial and less personal, allowed soldiers to think of combat as technical problem-solving rather than intimate violence. The flamethrower reversed this trend completely. It made death close, slow, impossible to abstract. It forced both operator and victim into an encounter with primal terror that no amount of training or ideological conditioning could fully prepare them for. German forces defending Normandy in June 1944 experienced this terror from the receiving end. Gefreiter Müller, who had trained on flamethrowers 18 months earlier, found himself assigned to bunker defense along the Atlantic Wall. His unit occupied a reinforced position overlooking Juno Beach, confident in their concrete walls and overlapping fields of fire. He wrote his final diary entry on June 7, 1944, one day after the invasion began. British infantry attempted to assault our position this morning. We repelled them easily. Machine gun fire from our firing ports cut them down before they crossed 50 meters. They retreated. I thought this meant victory. Then we heard the sound, like sustained thunder but wrong, mechanical, pressurized. I looked through the firing slit and saw the flamethrower team advancing. Just 2 men, one carrying the weapon, one providing covering fire. The same weapon I trained on, the same weapon I had nightmares about using. Now I understand what the mannequins represented. Now I am the mannequin. Muller survived. His bunker commander ordered evacuation before the flamethrower reached effective range, choosing to abandon the position rather than force his men to experience what they all knew was coming. The Atlantic Wall, that supposedly impregnable defensive line that Germany had spent years and enormous resources constructing, was systematically bypassed, not through overwhelming force but through the tactical application of terror. Bunkers that could withstand battleship bombardment were abandoned because their defenders knew what fire would do if it entered. The greatest defensive fortification of the war was defeated as much by psychology as by firepower. This is what the German engineers learned when they examined that captured British flamethrower. Not just how to build a better fuel mixture or improve propulsion systems. They learned that weapons could be so effective at creating fear that their mere existence changed battlefield calculations. They learned that humans could engineer not just destruction, but psychological collapse. Could design devices whose primary purpose was to make continued resistance feel impossible, even when it remained tactically feasible. They learned that the gap between theoretical weapon design and human experience of those weapons was measured not in specifications and test results but in nightmares and trauma, and choices between terrible deaths and worse survival. In the decades following World War II, military ethicists and international law scholars attempted to create frameworks for limiting particularly cruel weapons. The Geneva Conventions were expanded, protocols were added, categories of prohibited weapons were defined. Flamethrowers were never banned outright. Their tactical utility was considered too significant, their effects deemed acceptable within the broad category of legitimate military force. This tells you something about human capacity for rationalization and something about how modern warfare has normalized levels of violence that would have been considered monstrous in earlier eras. A weapon specifically designed to burn people alive, to exploit evolutionary terror responses, to create death so horrific that trained soldiers abandoned defensive positions rather than risk experiencing them. This weapon remained legal under international humanitarian law, acceptable, merely one more tool in the arsenal of modern militaries. The captured British flamethrower plans revealed more than engineering innovations. They revealed the gap between how militaries think about weapons in abstract and how soldiers experience those weapons in reality. They revealed how technical excellence can produce tactical effectiveness and moral horror simultaneously without contradiction. They revealed that humans are capable of designing devices whose sole purpose is maximizing suffering and then deploying those devices while maintaining narratives about military necessity and professional duty. They revealed that we can look directly at weapons that turn human beings into living torches and still find ways to classify them as legitimate tools of warfare rather than instruments of torture. Klaus Richter, in his 1946 interview, was asked if he regretted his role in helping Germany understand and attempt to replicate British flamethrower technology. His answer deserves to be quoted in full. "Regret is too simple a word for what I feel. I did my job professionally. I provided accurate technical analysis. I helped Germany develop equivalent weapons that were used to kill Allied soldiers who were themselves using these weapons to kill German soldiers. Everyone was burning everyone else and telling themselves it was justified by military necessity. The British designed the weapon I examined. I merely documented it. But documentation enabled replication, and replication enabled deployment, and deployment meant more men burned alive on all sides. Where in this chain does regret attach? To the engineer who designed the original? To me for explaining it? To the commanders who ordered its use? To the soldiers who operated it? We all participated. We all share the guilt. And we all convinced ourselves during the war that we were simply doing our duty within our assigned roles. This is how atrocity becomes normalized, not through evil people doing evil things, but through ordinary people doing their jobs and never confronting the cumulative weight of what those jobs produce." The flamethrower that German engineers examined in July 1942 was decommissioned after the demonstration tests. It sits today in a British military museum, labeled as an early model portable flamethrower with innovative fuel gel system. Museum placards note its technical specifications, its effective range, its role in breaching Axis defensive positions during the Italian and Normandy campaigns. What the placards do not mention, cannot mention without transforming a military history exhibit, into something much more uncomfortable, is what it felt like to be inside a bunker when 20 meters of burning gel flowed through your firing slit. What it felt like to operate the device knowing you were creating deaths that would haunt you forever. What it felt like to be an engineer examining captured plans and realizing you were looking at human ingenuity dedicated entirely to perfecting terror. What it felt like to live in a world where this was considered an acceptable weapon, a legitimate tool, a tactical innovation worthy of study and replication, rather than a horror that should have prompted every person in the development and deployment chain to refuse participation. The flame reached 20 meters. This is where we started. 20 meters of pressurized fire designed by humans, built by humans, used by humans against other humans in a war where every side convinced itself that its violence was justified and necessary, while the enemy's violence was barbaric and excessive. The mathematics worked perfectly. The engineering was flawless. The tactical effectiveness was undeniable. And in the gap between those technical truths and the human experience of burning alive exists everything we need to understand about how modern warfare transforms ordinary people into participants in mechanized cruelty, how professional duty and technical excellence can coexist with moral horror, and how we build weapons whose effects we refuse to fully confront even as we deploy them across battlefields worldwide. The German engineers found the British flamethrower plans and saw why it cleared bunkers in seconds. They saw the technical innovations, the fuel chemistry, the pressure systems, the tactical applications. What they could not see, what perhaps no one can see until they watch fire consume concrete and imagine being inside, is why we build these things at all. Why we dedicate human intelligence and resources and creativity to perfecting devices whose purpose is maximizing suffering. Why we call this military necessity. Why we classify it as legitimate warfare. Why we put these weapons in museums with clinical descriptions rather than in history books, with chapters titled Evidence of Humanity's Willingness to Engineer Its Own Damnation and Call It Progress. That is the story the captured plans told. Not just how to build a better flamethrower, but what it means that we wanted to.